Hey, you old black man, the service entrance is around back where you belong. Who allowed your low-class kind to walk through this door?
The slap landed before the gray-haired man could even turn his head. Brett Conley's open hand cracked across his face and snapped it sideways. And then, without missing a beat, Brett drove the heel of his palm into the old man's chest and shoved hard, throwing him off balance and sending him crashing down onto the floor of the staff dining room in front of everyone. The water pitcher on the side station went over with him, and a wash of melting ice spilled across the tiles and soaked into his plain gray clothes. Cruel laughter erupted from the long staff table. Brett stepped in close, planted one heavy boot down on the man's fallen bar towel, leaned over him, and hissed into his face.
Look at your dirty black face. A piece of scum like you isn't even worthy of licking boots in this five-star hotel. Get out and sit on the curb where you belong before I throw you in jail for trespassing!
The old man did not scream. He did not beg. He absorbed the pain in complete silence. And then, slowly, he pulled himself up off the wet floor. He reached down for the towel under Brett's boot, drew it out, and wiped the dirty ice water from his face with a chilling, unhurried calm. It was the calm of a man who had already decided, down to the hour, exactly how this was going to end. The managers kept laughing. Not one of them had the faintest idea that the man they had just slapped to the floor and humiliated in front of the entire staff was Solomon Reese, the self-made billionaire, the founder and ultimate owner of the Meridian hospitality empire, and the man whose name sat on the deed to the very building they were standing in. Every single one of them had just signed the death warrant on their own careers, and they did not even know it. Before we watch each one of these arrogant bullies receive exactly what they have earned, tell me in the comments which city or country you are watching from. Hit that subscribe button and turn on your notifications, because tomorrow's story is one you absolutely do not want to miss. Now let's get into how one undercover billionaire delivered the most devastating reality check these people will ever see. The staff dining room at the Meridian Crown smelled like burnt coffee and old steam, the way it always did at the turn of the morning shift. Nobody complained about it. Complaining was not a thing you did at the Crown. Not if you were smart. Not if you wanted your shift assignments to stay the way they were. Your sections to stay the good ones. Your name to stay off the wrong lists. Dale Brandt stood in the doorway like a man who owned the place. Because for every practical purpose that mattered, he did. He had watched the whole thing from that doorway with a coffee cup in one hand. And when Brett Conley's palm cracked across the old man's face, Dale Brandt had not moved, had not spoken, had not lifted a single finger. He had only smiled. Brandt was 49 years old, 22 years in the company, 11 of them running this property. He had a thick neck, a permanent half-smirk, and the particular confidence of a man who had never once paid for anything he had done. His name was not on the brass plate in any way that mattered to him, because titles were paperwork, and Dale Brandt did not run the Crown by paperwork. He ran it by knowing where every employee slept at night, who owed him a favor, and who was one write-up away from losing the only job they could find. From the newest banquet server to the oldest night porter, everybody understood the truth of this building. Dale Brandt ran it, and Dale Brandt decided who mattered and who did not. Margaret Lowe, the longtime managing director who had hired half the staff and protected the other half, had retired 14 months earlier. Good old Margaret, who knew everyone's children by name and never once let the culture of the house rot on her watch. In the 14 months since she walked out the front doors for the last time, Brandt had grown into the empty space. She left the way a weed grows into a crack in stone. He had taken over the scheduling personally. He had quietly buried 2 complaints that had come in through the corporate ethics line. killed them without explanation. He had started referring to himself, casually and often, as the acting regional director. He held no such title. He did not seem to care. You know what Margaret's problem was. Brandt said, swirling his coffee, as Conley dropped back into his chair to the applause of the table. Nosbein. The woman couldn't write up a busboy if he set the lobby on fire. He paused for the laugh. He got it. Karl Ostrander snorted into his cup. Conley leaned back, loose and grinning. A man without a single worry in the world. Brett Conley was 30 years old, built wide and built mean. The kind of young man who had never grown into himself and probably never would. He had attached himself to Brandt early. The way certain things attach and do not let go. And Brandt liked having him close. Because Conley would do the ugly thing out loud, so that Brandt would not have to. Karl Ostrander was older. 53. Red-faced. The director of facilities, with a bitterness baked so deep into him that it had stopped looking like bitterness and started looking like a personality. He believed in the marrow of his bones that 2 decades of service entitled him to say and do exactly as he pleased. Lindsay Cruz sat at the end of the table and laughed along quietly. She had learned, early and well, that laughing along was the only reliable way to keep from becoming the joke herself. Corporate is sending somebody this week, a duty supervisor said as she passed through the doorway. Not stopping, not making eye contact. Some kind of culture review. Brandt did not miss a beat. Yeah, I know. He waved a hand like he was shooing a fly. He had heard the rumor 3 days ago, and he had decided, plain and simple, that it meant nothing. He had seen culture reviews before. He had seen efficiency consultants and brand standards, auditors and earnest young people from headquarters with their clipboards and their surveys. They always came in wanting to change things. They always left tired and quiet, wondering what had happened to all their bright ideas. The Crown had eaten 3 corporate auditors in 8 years, and Dale Brandt had helped chew up every single one. And then there was the other rumor. The bigger one. The one he found almost funny. They said the founder himself might be touring the properties. Solomon Rees, the old man who had built the whole company out of nothing, who had not set foot in a working lobby in years, who lived behind a wall of lawyers and lieutenants and signed the checks from somewhere far away. Brandt had never met him. He pictured a frail figurehead, a retired man kept around for the brochures. Somebody you flattered for 10 minutes and then forgot. Let him come. Brandt thought, I will pour him a glass of his own wine, and he will fly home, believing the Crown is the finest house in the company. How long you give the culture lady? Ostrander asked. Brandt thought about it for exactly 1 second. 3 weeks. If she's tough. He smiled. She won't be tough. He raised his coffee cup toward the center of the room. A slow and deliberate toast. The kind that said, nothing changes here. Not today. Not ever. Conley raised his cup. Ostrander followed. Even Crew lifted hers. Just slightly. The fluorescent light over the lockers buzzed faintly in the quiet. And somewhere behind them, through the building's service entrance, a door had already opened and closed with barely a sound. Nobody had noticed. Nobody had turned around. They had been too busy laughing at a man on the floor. Solomon Rees had been watching men like Dale Brandt his entire life. He knew how they moved. He knew how they laughed. He knew the particular way they filled a room, loud and loose and completely certain of themselves. Right up until the moment the floor disappeared from under them. He had stepped through the service entrance of his own flagship hotel at 1 minute before 8 that morning, and he had let the heavy door settle shut behind him. And he had walked into a staff dining room and been slapped to the tile floor inside of 90 seconds. He had expected something. He had not expected that. And as he sat back down at the small steel table by the far wall, his cheek still burning red where Conley's hand had landed, the ice water still soaking cold through his shirt, he felt the old cold patience settle over him like a coat he had worn many times before. He was not dressed like the chairman of a hospitality empire. There was no tailored suit, no entourage, no manager rushing to take his coat. He wore plain gray work trousers and a plain gray work shirt with a small embroidered name tag over the left breast that read, in simple block letters, Sol. Engineering. The kind of tag a contract maintenance worker wears. The kind of tag that makes a person's eyes slide right past you to whatever they have decided matters more. That was exactly the point. He picked his fork up off the floor, set it aside, took a clean one, and pulled his tray back in front of him. He set a worn pocket notebook beside it. And then, with his face still wet and his shirt still cold, he simply watched. 3 months earlier, Vivian Osei had pushed a thick folder across a conference table without a word. Vivian was the company's chief operating officer, a woman of 51 who had come up the same way Solomon had. From the bottom, from the carts and the carpets and the night shifts, and who had never once learned how to look away from something that was wrong. Solomon had opened the folder and read every page while she waited. 9 complaints quietly dismissed in 4 years. 4 employees who had requested transfers off the property rather than fight what was happening to them. A paper trail full of holes where real records should have been time. And then there was Isaiah Brooks, 27 years old, an assistant front office manager with an evaluation file that read like a recommendation letter written by God, hired full of purpose. By his 3rd month at the Crown, the worst overnight rotations on the property, the shifts no one else would touch. By his 5th month, written up for things the white managers did every single day without comment. By his 8th month, gone, a 2-line resignation letter, and a young man who packed his pressed blazers into a cardboard box and tried to forget the whole thing had ever happened. Solomon had closed the folder slowly and looked up. Vivian had not touched her water since he started reading. "Tell me about Brant," he had said. "Not the file. Tell me what the file can't." She had folded her hands on the table. "Dale Brant is not stupid," she said. "That is the first thing you need to understand. He plays the loud, simple man, and it makes people underestimate him. They stop watching him carefully. That is exactly what he wants." She let that sit. He has spent 22 years building a machine inside that hotel. People who owe him, people who are afraid of him, people who have done small, ugly things to keep their jobs and do not want anyone looking too closely at any of it. He holds all of it, right here. And she had pressed 2 fingers to her own temple. And outside the hotel, Solomon had asked, "Lawrence Whitfield," she said, "the way you say the name of an old injury that never quite healed." He chairs the ownership entity that holds the Crown's real estate, and he sits on our own board. Whitfield and Brant have an arrangement nobody ever wrote down and nobody ever needed to. Brant keeps the flagship gleaming and keeps it quiet. No lawsuits. No headlines. No oversight committees. And Whitfield keeps the capital flowing and the questions soft. Any formal move against Brant that makes noise at the board level gets very complicated. Very fast. How complicated? He had asked. 3 auditors in 8 years complicated, she had said, holding his gaze. He will not come at you head on. That is not how he works. He will bury you in process. He will go to employee relations. He will get Whitfield to make noise in the trade press. And he will stand in the middle of all of it with clean hands and that smile of his. He has done it before. Isaiah Brooks, Solomon had said quietly. Something had shifted in her face. Just slightly. Isaiah Brooks had more potential than anyone we put through that property in a decade. she said. He runs the counter at a tire and brake shop on the east side now. He has a 4-year-old daughter. He will not return my calls. The room had been very quiet. Solomon had looked at the folder one last time. Then he had looked up and said, "Give me 10 days." Now he sat in his own staff dining room, his face still hot from a stranger's hand, eating off his own chipped plate, taking the measure of everything around him. He was 56 years old, broad through the shoulders, settled, with the stillness of a man who had made peace with difficulty a long time ago and stopped flinching at it. He had started in this industry at 16, carrying other men's luggage up other men's staircases, swallowing other men's contempt for tips that fed his mother and his sisters. He had built Meridian one property at a time, 23 of them now. From a single failing roadside inn he had bought with money he should never have been able to borrow. He had spent his entire life learning that the most dangerous person in any room is the one everybody has decided not to see. He worked methodically. Faces matched to the personnel photographs he had memorized over 3 months. Who deferred to whom? Who sat alone? Who laughed too hard? And who laughed too carefully? The loud table by the lockers confirmed everything Vivian had told him. Conley, Ostrander, Cree. The architecture of the rot was already visible. The ringleader in the doorway, the enforcer with the heavy hand, the followers nodding on cue, and the one who laughed but was not really laughing. He wrote in his notebook in a small, even hand, facts, times, names. Nothing dramatic. He took a slow sip of his coffee, and he was perfectly still in the way that very calm, very dangerous people are still. Not passive, not idle, but coiled and patient, waiting for the exact thing he knew was coming. He folded the bar towel in half and laid it neatly beside his tray. He looked across the room, found Brett Conley laughing in the center of his audience, and waited until the young man glanced his way. Then Solomon's eyes went once to the brass name tag pinned to Conley's lapel, read the name printed there, and settled on the man's face. He spoke, and his voice was calm and almost gentle, and it carried just far enough. "I'm not trespassing, Mr. Conley," he said, "but thank you for the welcome." The grin on Conley's face flickered. Just for a second, just the briefest hesitation, like a man who hears a sound he cannot quite place. He had not told this man his name. There was a tag on his own lapel, Monsieur, but that was not a thing a rented maintenance worker did. Read your name like that? Casually, with that kind of ease, like it was already filed somewhere inside him, already recorded, like the man on the floor a minute ago had been the one in control the whole time. The moment passed. The table was still laughing. Conley straightened up, spread his hands wide to his audience, and gave a little bow. But something cold had moved through his chest, and it did not entirely leave. Across the room, near the windows on the far side from the loud table, a young woman sat alone with a cup of coffee she had not touched. Dani Okafor, the overnight front desk lead, just off her shift, 28 years old, exhausted in the bones. She had watched the whole thing without moving. She had not laughed. She had not looked away, either. When Conley's hand had cracked across the old man's face, something in her own face had gone tight and pale, and she had half risen from her chair. And then she had stopped, because she had learned what happened to people at the Crown who stepped into Dale Brandt's line of fire. She sat there now, watching the gray-haired man wipe ice water from his collar with that terrible calm, and she felt sick with the old familiar shame of having stayed in her seat. Solomon felt her watching. He glanced up once and met her eyes across the room. Neither of them said a word. He looked back down at his breakfast and kept eating. He spent the rest of that first day being invisible on purpose. An engineering work order is a passport to anywhere. With a clipboard and a tool bag and a name tag that made him furniture, Solomon Reese walked every floor of his own hotel and saw it with the eyes of the lowest paid person in the building. He saw which housekeepers were handed the impossible floors, the checkout-heavy rotations stacked back to back with no help. He saw which bellman got the cash sections and which got sent to wait by the loading dock for hours. He saw the laminated section chart taped inside the front office back room. And he saw the small handwritten symbols beside certain names. And he understood. The way you understand a wound, by the way a person protects it. That the symbols were not about anyone's job performance. He listened. 2. Engineering men are background noise. People talk in front of them the way they talk in front of a vending machine. He fixed a sticking door in the laundry and listened to 2 housekeepers describe, in low voices, how a complaint to employee relations had a way of finding its way back to Mr. Brandt before the week was out. He reset a thermostat in the back office and listened to a banquet captain explain to a brand new hire, kindly, the way you teach a child to cross a busy street, which managers you never ever made look bad in front of guests, and which one you never let yourself be alone with after dark. The new hire asked which one that was. The banquet captain just said a name. The name was Conley. That evening, Solomon stayed long after the day staff had gone home to their families. He did this most evenings of that week. Not because the work required it, though it often did, but because a building tells you different things when it is empty. The paperwork people leave unfinished. The filing nobody bothers to hide once the performance of the day is over. He went to the front office back room, pulled the section archives, and laid them out under a single desk lamp. He spread 14 months of scheduling beside 4 years of dismissed complaints, and he matched the dates, and the names, and the symbols, and the pattern rose up out of the paper like a face surfacing in dark water. Every thread led to the same place. Every single one. The next morning, near the end of the breakfast shift, Solomon found Danny Okafor at the backroom copier, waiting on a stack of registration cards to print. He set down his tool bag and reached up to adjust a flickering ceiling fixture above her head that did not really need adjusting. You didn't laugh, he said quietly. Not looking down from the fixture, she went still. No, she said. I didn't. Why not? Danny was quiet for a moment. Then she said, because I knew Isaiah Brooks. He trained me on the overnight desk. He was the best manager I ever worked for. She paused. And because I have watched what happens to people who get on the wrong list around here, I have watched it for 2 years. I half stood up yesterday when that man hit you, and then I sat back down, the way I always sit back down, and I have been hating myself for it all morning. She looked up at him then, at the man on the small ladder in the gray work shirt, and her eyes narrowed, just slightly, with the beginning of a thought she did not yet dare to finish. Who are you? Really? She asked. Right now, Solomon said, climbing down. I'm the man asking the real question. He handed her a folded slip of paper. When your shift ends tonight, I'd like 15 minutes. The old records room on the 3rd floor. The one nobody uses. If you would rather not, throw the paper away. And we never had this conversation. And no one will ever know you spoke to me. You have my word on that. He picked up his tool bag and walked out before she could answer. She came. Of course she came. She sat across from him at a dusty table in the disused records room on the 3rd floor. And he opened a thick manila folder held shut with 2 rubber bands and set it on the table between them. She pulled the bands off, opened it, and went perfectly still. Inside was everything. Photographs of complaint forms with red dismiss stamps slashed across them. scheduling printouts with the coded symbols circled, personnel records with notes in the margins, a 6-year timeline, Isaiah Brooks's file, complete, flagged with a yellow tab, transfer requests, pattern analysis, names she recognized, dates she had lived through, things she had seen with her own eyes and quietly convinced herself nobody was bothering to write down. All of it written down. I've been building this for 3 months. Solomon said, before I ever set foot in this building, the morning Mr. Conley put me on that floor was part of it. You watched it happen. It was not a question. Yes, she said. I need someone on the inside. Someone who knows this hotel from the floor. Not from a spreadsheet. Someone who has seen what I've documented and can confirm it from direct experience. On the record, with full protection, he slid a second, smaller document across the table. That is a confidential cooperation and whistleblower protection agreement, drafted by outside counsel, not by anyone inside this company. It shields you legally, and it places your statement on a record that Dale Brandt cannot touch and cannot reach. Danny looked at the agreement, then back up at him. If I start talking, she said, he will figure out it was me. He always figures it out. Yes, Solomon said. Eventually. That is why the case has to be airtight before he does. She looked down at the page. How many times have you done this? She asked. Walked into a place like this one. This is the kind of thing I built the whole company to be the opposite of, he said. And I have never once let a man like Dale Brandt keep a building I am responsible for. He met her eyes. I have never lost. She picked up the pen. Through the wire glass window of the records room door, far down the dim third-floor corridor, Dale Brandt stood motionless near the service elevator, watching the closed door at the end of the hall. He did not know what was behind it. He only knew that the new maintenance man had gone up to 3 after hours, and that Danny Okafor had followed him 10 minutes later, and that something about the two of them made the back of his neck go cold. His smile was completely gone. By the second full day, Brandt had begun to move. That was how Brandt always started. Small and deniable. Nothing you could put a finger on. By mid-morning, the routing of the corporate culture review had been quietly adjusted. The interview slots that should have gone to housekeeping and the overnight staff had been rescheduled, bumped, double-booked, shuffled onto days when the right people happened to be off the property. The review team from headquarters found themselves talking to banquet captains and front desk supervisors who said, almost word for word, that the Crown was the finest house in the company and Mr. www.com. Brandt was the heart of it. It was not sabotage you could prove. It was just friction. Just enough friction to keep the truth out of the room. By noon, Brandt had made 2 phone calls to Roland Pike, the head of employee relations, a soft-spoken man who owed Brandt 3 favors and knew it. The calls were friendly, casual. The kind of conversation that does not sound like anything at all until you understand what is being planted. Brandt mentioned, gently, that there was a new contract maintenance worker on site who had been seen loitering in restricted areas and engaging staff inappropriately during work hours. Just raising it. Brandt said, just making sure employee relations has a record, in case something needs to be addressed later. Pike said he would make a note. Brandt hung up, satisfied. He was building a file of his own. What Brandt did not see was what was happening on the other side of his hotel. Solomon Reese had quietly arranged, through Vivian, a series of engineering and facilities surveys, 15-minute walkthroughs with staff in every department, framed as routine equipment checks, the kind of thing nobody looks at twice. That was how it appeared from the outside. From the inside, each survey was something else entirely. Solomon sat with one employee at a time, in a quiet utility room or an empty banquet hall, with the same calm and open expression, and asked the same careful questions. How long have you been here? What is working? What is not? What do you wish the people upstairs understood? Most of the senior, comfortable staff gave him nothing. Polite. Closed. Practiced. They had learned to give nothing. But the others were different. A 26-year-old housekeeping supervisor named Camila Ortiz came in for her 15 minutes and left after 40 annex place. She spoke carefully at first, then less carefully, then not carefully at all. She described her first year at the Crown in a steady voice, with her hands clasped tight in her lap, promotions that went to people with less seniority and no explanation. A formal complaint she had filed 11 months ago that she had never received a single word of response to. A schedule that always, somehow, put her on the floors no one else wanted. Alone. With the heaviest checkouts. Solomon listened without interrupting. He took quiet notes. He thanked her when she finished and told her she had done the right thing. She looked at him like she was not sure she believed that yet. She was the fourth employee to give him something real. By the end of the second day, she was one of 9. There was Tyler Reyes, 24 years old, 6 months, a bellman, who described in a low, fast voice the impossible cash quotas and the sections built so that he could not possibly meet them, and the write-ups that appeared in his file without warning or conversation. There was Gloria Banks, a housekeeper of 10 years, who pressed a folded sheet of paper into Solomon's hand. A copy of a complaint she had filed 2 years earlier, routed straight to Brandt. Never heard of again. She had kept her own copy because something inside her had told her to, and there was a line cook named Dev who said only 3 sentences, asked for nothing, and walked back to his station. That evening, Solomon sat alone in the 3rd-floor records room with his encrypted. The notebook had 12 names in it now. 6 directly documented incidents with dates and witnesses. A clear, rising picture of a machine that had been running in the dark for a very long time. He cross-referenced everything against the dossier he had built over 3 months, and the patterns lined up exactly. The complaints filed and vanished. The people who left without an exit interview. Isaiah Brooks at the center of it all, like a wound that had never been allowed to heal. Dale Brandt thought he was poisoning the well. What he was actually doing was buying Solomon time. On the 3rd night, the building had emptied to a skeleton crew. A handful of overnight staff. The hum of the ventilation. The distant chime of the elevators arriving at empty floors. Danny Okafor sat at a terminal in the front office back room with a cup of cold coffee and a growing sense of unease. Her access to the property's historical complaint logs had been granted at Solomon's request through Vivian. Quietly processed as a routine records audit. The kind of administrative task nobody looks at twice. In practice, she was working her way backward through 6 years of filed complaints, matching dismissal dates, signature, and routing logs. Every thread led to the same place. Every single one. She had been at it for 2 hours when she heard footsteps in the hallway. She minimized her screen without thinking. The footsteps passed. She exhaled. She was reaching for her coffee when she noticed the light. Brandt's office was directly across the corridor from the back room. It was always locked. She had never once seen that door open when Brandt was not physically inside it. But right then, late on a weeknight, the door stood open 3 inches, and the desk lamp inside was burning. She could hear him somewhere down the hall. From the direction of his footsteps a minute earlier, she sat very still for a full 10 seconds. Then she stood, crossed the corridor, and looked through the gap. The office was cluttered, the way powerful men's offices get cluttered, not from disorder but from accumulation. years of favors and files, and the comfortable mess of a man who never expected anyone to go through his things. The desk was buried in paper, and there, half hidden beneath a manila folder on the left side, was a small locked drawer that had been left slightly open, and protruding from its lock, barely an inch, was a small black flash drive, unmarked, personal, completely separate from any company system. Danny's heart was slamming. She did not touch the door. She did not step inside. She pulled her phone from her pocket, angled it through the gap, and took 3 photographs: the drawer, the drive, the full desk in context, clean and clear. Then she was back at her terminal, with her screen restored, before Brant's footsteps came back down the hall. She heard his door pull shut. The lock clicked. She stared at her screen without reading a word of it. Then she opened her messages, sent the 3 photographs to the number Solomon had given her, and typed 2 words: records room. He arrived in 20 minutes. In plain clothes. No tag. No markings. Through the service entrance, without a sound. She showed him the photographs. He studied them without speaking, expanded the image of the drive, set the phone down on the table between them, and went very still in the way she was beginning to recognize. Not hesitation, but the quiet of a man running calculations faster than he was letting on. A personal drive. Kept completely off our systems, he said finally, locked separately from his official files. He paused. That is either his insurance policy, or it is evidence of something we have not found yet. How do we get it? She asked. Not by breaking into his office. Anything we take that way is worthless. And it hands him a weapon. He looked at her. We do it the right way, through outside counsel, with a preservation demand and a forensic order. The moment the case is strong enough to compel it, which means more people in the circle, more exposure, more risk. So we wait until waiting cannot hurt us anymore. He picked up her phone and handed it back. You did everything right tonight. You documented what you found exactly as you found it. And you touched nothing. That is the difference between a story and a case. She nodded. She gathered her things, and they walked out together through the service entrance into the staff garage. The cold hit them immediately. Danny stopped. Both front tires of her car were flat, not slowly deflated, slashed clean. The cuts were deliberate and deep. She looked at them for a moment without speaking. There is no camera on this corner of the garage, she said quietly. No, Solomon said. There isn't. He took out his phone and photographed the tires methodically. Close up. Wide angle. The surrounding bays. He checked the time. Then made a call to the building services emergency line and requested, on the record and time-stamped, the immediate installation of cameras covering the northeast corner of the staff garage. Official channels. A paper trail Brant could not erase. He hung up and looked at her. They're guessing, he said. They do not know what you have told me. This is a warning built on suspicion, not on information. Does that make it better? She asked. He met her eyes. No, he said. It makes them sloppy. And sloppy men leave marks they cannot walk back. He drove her to her sister's apartment himself. Neither of them said much along the way. That night, after he had seen Danny safely inside, Solomon went back to the empty hotel, climbed to the 3rd floor, and read Isaiah Brooks's file the way you read something for the first time, even when you have read it 3 times before. He knew the dates by heart, but reading a file in preparation and reading it inside the building where it happened were 2 completely different acts. Isaiah Brooks had been hired with the highest interview scores the regional office had recorded in years. His first 6 months read like a success story. 2 written commendations for handling impossible guest situations with grace. A thank you letter from a family whose disabled child he had quietly moved heaven and earth to accommodate. A clean record. No discipline. Reviews marked exceeds expectations in every category. Then the file changed. Month 7. Reassigned from the day desk to the permanent overnight rotation. The shift's senior staff systematically avoided, with no explanation noted anywhere. Month 8. The first write-up. For failure to complete shift documentation within the required window, Solomon cross-referenced the date against the schedule he had pulled. Isaiah had been covering a double that night for a manager whose absence Brandt himself had approved. Month 9. A second write-up. For insubordination. The details so vague as to be meaningless. No witnesses named. No record of what the directive had even been excellence. Month 10. A formal complaint filed by Isaiah. Targeted harassment. Discriminatory scheduling. A hostile environment. 3 pages. Detailed. Specific. Dated. Solomon turned the page. The complaint had been routed through the property's internal review process. The reviewer listed was Dale Brandt. The finding. Insufficient évidence. Complaint dismissed. Isaiah had never been notified of the outcome. There was no record of anyone telling him. His copy of the dismissal, which company policy required be delivered in person and signed for, had never been signed. Brandt had buried it without leaving a fingerprint. Month 11. A transfer request. Denied within 48 hours. Faster than the standard 2-week processing. Signed by Brandt. Month 12. A 2-line resignation. No exit interview conducted. The file ended there. Solomon closed it slowly and sat with it in his hands. He thought about what Vivian had told him. He runs the counter at a tire shop now. He will not return my calls. He thought about a young man who had been the best in a decade, who had a thank you letter from a family with a disabled child, who had folded his blazers into a box and tried to pretend none of it had happened, because fighting it felt like throwing himself against a wall that did not move. He picked up his pen and turned to a fresh page and began a clean, organized summary of every documented incident in Isaiah's history. Dates. References. Cross-references to the other accounts. The kind of record that cannot be waved away. He thought about calling Isaiah that night. He decided against it. The case was not strong enough yet, and bringing Isaiah in too early meant exposing him before the protection was fully built. When Solomon called, the ground would have to be solid. He owed Isaiah Brooks that much. He locked the file in the cabinet, turned off the lamp, and walked out through a building that had no idea what was coming. On the 4th day, Lawrence Whitfield went to war the way wealthy men go to war, with a phone, a brunch, and a friendly journalist. Whitfield was 62, silver-haired, polished to a high shine by 3 decades of making other people's problems disappear for a price. He chaired the ownership entity that held the Crown's land and lease, which meant the property's biggest financial decisions ran through his hands. He and Brandt had an arrangement that had never been written down and never needed to be. Brandt kept the flagship quiet and profitable. No lawsuits, no headlines, no oversight, and Whitfield kept the money soft and the questions softer. It was a clean arrangement. Solomon Reese, poking around in his contract maintenance shirt with his suspicious surveys, threatened to make it very messy. Brandt had called Whitfield from the far corner of the staff garage that morning, his back to the building. His collar up, he had laid it out carefully. The culture review, the maintenance man who was clearly something more, the after-hours meetings, the 40-minute equipment survey with a housekeeper who had left in tears. I need noise. Brandse, public noise, something that makes whatever they're cooking up look like the real problem. Before it makes me look like one. Whitfield was quiet for a moment. Leave it with me, he said. By 11, Whitfield had called 2 members of the Regional Hospitality Board and an editor he had known for 15 years at the industry trade outlet. Everyone in the business read. By the afternoon, a story had gone up under the banner of leadership stability. It praised Dale Brandt by name as the steady hand who had carried the crown through the difficult years since Margaret Lowe's retirement. It raised, with the practiced ease of a man who had been planting suggestions his whole life, questions about an unannounced corporate intervention at the property, outside actors disrupting a flagship that was, by every financial measure, thriving. It quoted an unnamed source describing chaos and morale problems caused by the review. It never named Solomon Reese. It did not need to. Solomon read it on his tablet in the records room with the volume of the world turned all the way down. He called Vivian. Whitfield chairs the ownership board, she said before he could speak. He is untouchable at the governance level right now. A direct run at him creates more noise than it solves. I know, Solomon said. He is trying to make you the controversy, she said. Make the founder's own house cleaning look erratic. So nobody ever looks at Brandt. I know that too, he said. A pause. So what do you do? Nothing, Solomon said. Not yet. He hung up. He opened his notebook to a fresh page and wrote 2 words at the top. Protective infrastructure. Beneath that, in clean, even letters, Lawrence Whitfield. He looked at the name for a long moment. Whitfield thought this was about a flattering trade article and a soft board and a reclusive old man who could be steered. He thought this was small. He had no idea what was inside the folder locked in the records room 3 floors up, or how long Solomon had been building it, or what it would look like when it was finished. Solomon capped his pen and went back to work. The 5th day arrived with a change in the air. Solomon felt it the moment he came through the service entrance. It was subtle. The kind of shift you sense before you can name it. Housekeepers who had kept their eyes down all week made brief, direct contact as he passed. A bellman held the service elevator door without being asked. The little cluster that always formed around Brandt's corner of the back office was thinner that morning, the orbit looser. Small things, but Solomon had built a company out of reading small things. He set 2 folders on the records room table that morning. One was the completed internal report, 31 pages, fully documented, cross-referenced, airtight. The kind of report that does not get talked out of a room. The other was a sealed envelope addressed to the company's general counsel and to Vivian Osei, jointly, requesting a full forensic preservation order on Dale Brandt's office, his devices, and one specific personal drive. He squared them both in the center of the table. Vivian arrived at noon, in plain clothes, a gray coat, a leather portfolio under her arm. Through the service entrance without announcement, she read the report the way she read everything, thoroughly, without expression, turning each page with the same controlled attention. It took her 22 minutes. Solomon drank his coffee and waited. When she finished, she closed the folder and laid it flat. This is enough, she said. I know, he said. I can have the forensic order and the termination paperwork drawn up tonight. She said. We move on. Brandt first thing tomorrow. Suspension. Then a clean exit for cause. Once the drive is imaged, the harassment record goes to outside counsel and to the Federal Commission simultaneously. She paused. He will not see it coming. No, Solomon said. He won't. She studied him a moment. How are you holding up? He considered it. Ask me at the end of the summit. She almost smiled. The company's annual managers' summit was scheduled for the Crown's grand ballroom in 2 days. The property leadership all in one room. The very stage Brandt expected to be celebrated on. Vivian gathered the report into her portfolio and stood. "First thing tomorrow," she said. "First thing," he confirmed, through the wire glass of the records room door. Far down the corridor, Dale Brandt stood motionless. Watching, he moved first. Solomon should have expected it. And in truth he had. Sometime between the morning and the early afternoon of that 5th day, someone tipped Brandt. Solomon never learned exactly who or exactly when, but Brandt knew the report was coming, and he knew roughly what was in it. And he did not wait to be hit. Vivian called late that night. Her voice was different, clipped, controlled in the specific way of a person who has just received very bad news and is managing it with both hands. "We have a problem," she said. Solomon set down his pen. "Tell me." She talked for 9 minutes. He listened without interrupting, one hand flat on the table, his eyes fixed on the middle distance, taking it all in, not reacting, not catastrophizing. The shape of it became clear quickly. Brandt had gone to Whitfield. Whitfield had spent the afternoon working the board, calling in debts, applying pressure through channels that never appeared in any minutes. And by the end of the day, a single procedural order had been signed, buried in the language of governance, dressed up as routine. The internal investigation into the Crown had been consolidated, reassigned from the company's independent ethics and compliance office to a newly formed brand standards review committee, a committee with no independence at all. A committee chaired, conveniently, by a man named Preston Vale, who sat on the board's audit and ethics committee, who had signed the order himself. "Val," Solomon said. "There is more," Vivian said. "Preston Vale is Lawrence Whitfield's brother-in-law." There it was. Not just Brandt. Not just Whitfield. The man with formal authority over the company's own ethics machinery, bound by blood and aligned by interest, signing the paperwork that surgically removed the one channel built to receive everything Solomon had documented. "And the report?" he asked. "In the new structure," Vivian said, "any harassment finding routes to Vale's committee first. He controls whether it ever leaves the building. A pause, heavier than the last. And Brandt filed something of his own this afternoon. A formal grievance, through employee relations and up to the board, claiming that the undercover engineering survey was deceptive surveillance of staff, a hostile and manufactured operation designed to entrap and intimidate longtime employees. He is calling it abuse of the workforce. Conley and Ostrander have signed supporting statements. So has Lindsay Crew. 4 signatures already. The room was very quiet. "He's calling my walking into my own hotel an act of abuse," Solomon said flatly. "He's calling it whatever word makes the board move fastest," Vivian said. "And right now, with Whitfield steering and Vale holding the gate, the board is reviewing it, which at this stage means the same thing as backing it." Solomon looked at the sealed envelope and the 31-page report squared on the table in front of him. 6 years of documented cruelty, every vanished complaint, every suppressed transfer, every name, every date, all of it real, all of it thorough, and all of it completely useless without a legitimate channel to receive it. Brandt had not beaten the evidence. He had beaten the system that was supposed to process it. "Go home," Vivian said quietly. "Get some rest. We will figure this out tomorrow. Good night." "Vivian," he said. He hung up and sat in the lamplight without moving for a long time. The building was silent around him. The report sat 12 inches from his right hand. The same report he had squared with such quiet satisfaction that afternoon. certain that tomorrow would be the beginning of the end. He had been right about that, just not in the way he had expected. He reached over and turned off the lamp. Then, in the dark, he picked up his phone and scrolled to a number he had not yet dialed. Isaiah Brooks. His thumb hovered. He pressed call. Isaiah picked up on the fourth ring. His voice was thick with sleep. And underneath the sleep, there was something older. A weariness that had settled into him. The way things settle when they have been there long enough to stop feeling like a choice. "Hello, Isaiah," Solomon said, keeping his voice quiet and steady. "My name is Solomon Reese. I founded the company that owns the Meridian Crown. I am calling you myself." Silence. Not the silence of a man who had fallen back asleep, the silence of a man who had gone very still on the other end of the line. "I have read your file," Solomon continued. "All of it. Every write-up. Every complaint. The transfer they denied in 48 hours. The dismissal they never let you sign." He paused. "I know what they did to you in that building." The silence stretched. Then Isaiah Brooks said, "I always wondered if anybody up there even knew my name." They talked for 2 hours. Solomon sat at the dusty records room table in the dark, with a cup of coffee going cold beside him and his notebook open. And he listened the way he had trained himself to listen over 40 years. Completely. Without rushing. Without filling the quiet spaces with his own voice. Isaiah talked slowly at first. Carefully. The way you talk about something that hurt you badly when you are not yet sure the person on the other end has earned the whole truth of it. He talked about his first months at the Crown. The commendations. The letter from that family. The genuine belief that he had found the place where he was supposed to be. Then he talked about what came after. The overnight exile. The write-ups that landed in his file like ambushes. The complaint that vanished. The transfer that came back stamped no. The morning he had sat in his car in that same staff garage for 45 minutes and then driven home instead of clocking in. "I kept a notebook," Isaiah said. Solomon looked up. "What kind of notebook?" "A personnel one. Dated. Every incident. Every conversation. Every time something happened that I knew, in my gut, was wrong. I wrote it all down because I couldn't sleep. I'd come home at 6 in the morning and write it out just to get it out of my head." His voice was flat and factual. The voice of a man who had turned the thing over 1,000 times. "I never filed any of it. I didn't think anyone would ever read it." "I'll read it," Solomon said. A longer silence. "I have a daughter," Isaiah said. "She's 4. Her name is Nia." He stopped. "I need you to tell me this is real. That something is actually going to happen this time. And I'm not just... It's real," Solomon said. "But I have to ask you something difficult." "Ask it." "I need you to come back to the building. Not tonight. The day after tomorrow. We are holding the company managers' summit in the ballroom. I need you to walk in front of all of them." He waited. "I know exactly what I am asking." The silence on the other end was the longest yet. "You want me to walk back in there?" Isaiah said quietly. "In front of him?" "Yes." Solomon heard him breathe once. Slowly. In and out. "Tell me what you have," Isaiah said. Solomon told him. Not everything. Not the operational details. Not the names he was still protecting. But enough. The dossier. The documented pattern. 6 years of suppressed complaints. The scope of what was coming. When he finished, Isaiah was quiet for a moment. "Okay," he said finally. "Okay. Tell me what time." Solomon hung up and sat with the phone in his hand. It was nearly 3 in the morning. He opened his contacts and scrolled to a name he had added 3 months earlier and hoped he would not have to use this soon. Yolanda Cross. civil rights and employment litigator. 25 years. Never beaten in a courtroom she had chosen to walk into. He had sent her the preliminary dossier in December as a precaution. When Vivian first brought him the file, and the real shape of what he was walking into had become clear. He had not been certain then that the case would ever leave the company. He was certain now. The moment Preston Vale signed that order, and Brandt filed that grievance, and 4 employees put their names on coordinated statements against people who had dared to report discrimination. The matter crossed a line, suppressing a discrimination investigation, retaliating against witnesses, building a paper case to punish people for cooperating. None of that is an internal personnel dispute. That is unlawful retaliation under federal civil rights law. That is the kind of thing federal investigators open files on. And there was the assault on top of all of it. A manager striking a man to the floor in front of a room full of witnesses. Which is not a personnel matter either. It is a crime. He pressed call. She picked up on the second ring. She had been awake. Solomon. She said simply, "They moved tonight." He said, "Whitfield got his brother-in-law to take over our ethics process and gate the investigation." And Brandt filed a retaliation grievance dressed up as a workforce complaint, with 4 coordinated signatures. Against employees who cooperated with me. A pause. Brief and precise. That's retaliation, she said. And obstruction of a protected process. The signatures make it coordinated. The brother-in-law's order makes it traceable to the top. He heard a lamp click. The rustle of paper. "There's one more thing," Solomon said. "On my first morning, before anyone knew who I was, the assistant manager slapped me to the floor of the staff dining room and threatened to have me jailed for trespassing. In front of the entire shift. There were witnesses. There may be camera footage." Yolanda Cross was silent for a moment. Then her voice changed. Went lower and harder. "Then we are not only talking to the Federal Commission," she said. "We are talking to the prosecutor. How many witnesses do you have with first-hand, documented experience of the pattern?" 9 who have spoken, Solomon said. 3 with their own contemporaneous records. 1 former employee with a personal journal covering an entire year, and a sealed dossier I have been building since December. Then the door is open. Yolanda said, "Where do you want me?" "The Meridian Crown. The day after tomorrow. The Grand Ballroom. The company summit. 11 o'clock. Bring whoever you need. Come in the front. We will be there," she said. He hung up. He closed his notebook. He did not sleep. The morning of the summit arrived clear and cold. Solomon Reese did not come through the service entrance. He came through the front doors of his flagship hotel in a charcoal suit that fit him the way a thing fits when it has been made for the man wearing it. No work shirt. No name tag reading Soul. No tool bag. He crossed the marble lobby he had imagined into existence 2 decades ago. Past the front desk and the bell stand, and the great spray of flowers under the chandelier. And the doorman straightened without quite knowing why. And the lobby itself seemed to shift around him the way a room shifts when someone walks in who outranks everyone present. He went directly to the Grand Ballroom, where the manager's summit was being set, and he stood at the back, near the wall, and he waited. He did not pace. He did not check his watch. He stood the way he had stood his entire life. Like a man who had already decided how this was going to go and was simply waiting for the rest of the world to catch up. The property's leadership filtered in. They came in pairs and clusters, mid-conversation, coffee in hand, settling into the rows of chairs arranged before the small stage with its podium and its banner that read One House. The front office team, the food and beverage managers, the housekeeping leads, the banquet captains. Brett Conley arrived loud, holding court near the front, certain of his place in the world. Certain there were no consequences in it that could ever reach him. Carl Ostrander followed, sour and heavy. Lindsay Crew came in quiet and took an aisle seat near the back. Where Solomon noticed, she had positioned herself like a person sitting near an exit. Dale Brandt arrived, carrying confidence like a weapon. Word had reached him through Whitfield and through Roland Pike. The grievance was filed and gaining traction. Vale held the ethics gate. The board was wobbling. And the so-called founder was nothing but a reclusive old man, poking at things he did not understand. Brandt expected to walk into a room where he would be celebrated as the steady hand who had kept the flagship gleaming, and to come out of it untouchable. He took a reserved seat in the front row, smoothed his tie, and surveyed his kingdom. He did not look at the man in the charcoal suit standing at the back wall. People see what they expect to see. And Dale Brandt did not expect to see anything that morning except the room he had built. Danny Okafor came in and took a seat near the back. She looked at the man by the wall for half a second. He gave her nothing, but she understood. Vivian Osei entered through the side door in a sharp dark suit and stood to the right of the stage without a word. Several managers straightened involuntarily. At 11 o'clock exactly, Solomon heard the front doors of the hotel open down the corridor, and the room did not hear them coming so much as feel them. A change in the air near the entrance, a shift in pressure, the way the atmosphere drops before a storm. Then the ballroom doors opened and 3 people walked in, displaying credentials. Yolanda Cross was 52, compact and precise, with the bearing of a woman who had spent a quarter-century in courtrooms and never once lost her footing in one. She wore a dark suit and carried a leather portfolio, and she walked to the side of the room without hurrying and without looking at anyone in particular, which somehow made everyone in the room look at her. Beside her was an investigator from the regional office of the Federal Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, and beside him, an attorney from the company's real outside firm, not Vale's captured committee. The murmur in the room thinned and died. Then the doors opened a second time. Isaiah Brooks walked in. He was 27 years old, and he wore a clean dark suit, pressed sharp, the shoes polished to a mirror. He had clearly spent time on it. He stood in the doorway for just a moment, and Solomon could see exactly what it cost him to be here. In this building, in front of these people, he could see it in the set of his jaw and in the way his hands stayed perfectly still at his sides through what had to be an enormous act of will. His eyes moved once across the room and settled on Dale Brandt. Brandt looked back, and something passed across his face that he could not quite suppress. A flash of something raw and ugly. There and gone in an instant, Solomon Reese walked to the podium. He moved without urgency. He set both hands on the edges of the stand and looked out over the room. And the recognition moved through the front rows in a slow, terrible wave. It reached Conley first. Conley's eyes went to the man at the podium, to the charcoal suit, to the face, and then to the memory of a gray-haired maintenance worker on the floor of the staff dining room, wiping ice water off his collar, saying, "I'm not trespassing. Mr. Conley." The blood left Conley's face. Ostrander's jaw went slack. Lindsay Crew looked at the podium and then immediately down at her own hands. And Dale Brandt, in the front row, went absolutely rigid. His expression no longer an expression at all, but a careful, blank mask. The face of a man performing composure while the floor drops out beneath him. "Good morning," Solomon said. His voice carried to every corner of the room without rising. "For those who have not met me, my name is Solomon Reese. I founded this company 41 years ago. I own a controlling interest in the entity that employs every person in this room. He let that stand for a moment. Some of you have already met me this week. I have spent the past several days working the overnight engineering rotation at this property, under a different name, watching how this house treats the people who keep it standing. His eyes moved, unhurried, to the front row. On my first morning here, one of you slapped me to the floor of the staff dining room and told me to go sit on the curb where my kind belongs. A great many of you laughed. He let the silence answer for them. I have learned a great deal this week. The silence in the ballroom had weight now. It pressed down on specific people, and it pressed down hard. Before we go on, Solomon said, I would like to introduce some people who came here this morning at my invitation. He named Yolanda Cross and her title and her firm, and the investigator and his office. The way you state facts that need no decoration. Yolanda stepped forward. The Federal Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, she said, her voice measured and absolute, has opened a formal investigation into employment practices at this property. The investigation covers a documented pattern of racial discrimination in scheduling, promotion, and discipline, the systematic suppression of internal complaints, and, as of yesterday, unlawful retaliation against employees who cooperated with this company's own founder, including the coordinated filing of false statements and the deliberate obstruction of an active discrimination inquiry. She looked at the room without expression. That investigation is now active, and it is federal in jurisdiction. Any further act of retaliation against any witness, by anyone in this room, is itself a federal violation. And separately, she added, the physical assault committed against Mr. Asa Reese on the floor of your staff dining room this week has been referred to the district attorney's office. That is no longer an internal matter. It is a criminal one. The chandeliers hummed faintly. Nobody moved. Solomon turned slightly. Isaiah, he said quietly, would you like to say anything? Isaiah Brooks walked to the front of the room. He stood beside the stage and looked directly at Dale Brandt. And when his voice came, it was steady and clear and left no room in the world for misunderstanding. I gave this place everything I had, he said, and it spent 8 months teaching me that everything I had would never be enough because of what I look like. I packed up and I left. And I told myself it didn't matter, because that was easier than knowing it did. He paused, and his jaw tightened, and he held it. I came back today so that my daughter never has to learn that lesson in a building with my family's company name over the door. That's the only reason I'm standing here. So this doesn't happen to the next one. The room was silent enough to hear the lights. Nobody spoke for a long moment after Isaiah finished. The silence was enormous. It pressed down on the room like a physical weight. Men who had laughed in the staff dining room sat with their eyes fixed on the floor. The people who had signed Brandt's grievance without a second thought stared at the walls like they were looking for a door that was not there. Vivian Osei stepped forward. She held a single sheet of paper in her right hand. She crossed to the front of the room with the slow, deliberate pace of someone who understood that speed would rob the moment of everything it deserved. She had waited a long time for this. She was not going to rush it. Dale Brandt, she said. The name landed like a stone dropped into still water. Brandt looked up. His face had gone somewhere. Faces go when every defense a man has built over 22 years collapses at the same instant. A rigid, terrible blankness. Like a building in the second after the walls come down, and before the dust has settled. Effective immediately, Vivian said, her voice filling every inch of the room. You are relieved of your duties as general manager and placed on suspension, pending the outcome of the federal investigation and the company's own independent review, which has been removed from the committee you and Mr. Vale created and returned to outside counsel as of 1 hour ago. Your performance bonuses and your unvested equity in this company are frozen and subject to clawback. You will surrender your keys, your master credentials, and your company devices to outside counsel before you leave this building today. And you will not return to it. She stopped. The room waited. Brandt stood. The movement was slow and stiff, like a man whose body had aged 10 years in 10 minutes. He reached into his jacket out of pure muscle memory, straightened a tie that did not need straightening, something to do with his hands while the room watched. Then he took the heavy ring of master keys off his belt and held it for a moment in his palm. 22 years. He set it on the table at the front. The sound it made, that small, flat, metallic clatter against the wood, was the loudest thing in the room. Several people flinched without meaning to. He laid his phone and his credential card beside the keys. His hands were shaking, both of them. A fine, uncontrollable tremor that ran from his wrists to his fingertips and did not stop. He stepped back. He straightened his jacket again. That same useless gesture. And he walked toward the doors. His back was straight. His face was empty. He did not look at Conley. He did not look at Ostrander. He did not look at Lindsay Crew, who had laughed the loudest in the staff dining room and was now staring at her own hands in her lap like she did not recognize them. He did not look at Isaiah Brooks, but he passed within a few feet of him on the way to the doors, and Isaiah did not move, did not speak, stood absolutely still with his hands at his sides, and watched Brandt go by with an expression that carried 3 years of a man's life in it. 3 years of the worst kind of quiet, the kind that settles over you when you have been told over and over, by the sheer weight of institutional silence, that what happened to you did not matter. It mattered. The ballroom doors swung shut behind Dale Brandt, with a sound like a period at the end of a very long sentence. Yolanda Cross stepped forward and opened her portfolio. Brett Conley. Conley looked up, and for one unguarded second, his face was completely open, stripped of the grin, stripped of the performance, stripped of everything the staff dining room had been built on. What was underneath was something much smaller than the man who had stood over a stranger and put him on the floor with an audience at his back. You are terminated for cause. Effective immediately, Yolanda said, and you are named in the federal complaint and in a civil action that will be filed on behalf of this company and its affected employees. You are also the subject of a criminal referral to the district attorney for assault and battery, with a hate crime enhancement, arising from your conduct this week. The misconduct documented against you includes harassment, the physical assault of a colleague, and participation in coordinated retaliation. Every word of it is supported by time-stamped records, the testimony of multiple witnesses, and the sworn statement of Solomon Reese. You will surrender your credentials and leave this building. Her voice never rose. It did not need to. Every word was a wall. Conley's mouth opened. Something started to come out of it. A protest. A reflex. The last automatic reach for a world where he could still talk his way out of something. The look on Yolanda's face stopped it cold. He stood, fumbled with his credential card twice before it came loose, set it on the table beside Brandt's keys with a hand that could not quite hold steady, and walked out. He looked at no one. The same vacancy that had descended on Brandt descended on him. Ostrander and Cree came next. When Yolanda spoke their names, Ostrander's jaw worked like a man trying to chew through something too hard for his teeth. He was informed that the supporting statement he had signed without hesitation to help bury people who had done nothing but tell the truth had been flagged as potential evidence of coordinated retaliation and was now part of a federal record. His face collapsed through 3 expressions in 4 seconds. Lindsay Crew said nothing. She sat with both hands flat on the table in front of her, pressing down like she needed to feel something solid and she stared at a fixed point on the far wall. And she did not cry. But it was close. She had laughed. She had sat in that staff dining room, and she had laughed. And she had known, on some level, the way you always know, even when you choose not to, that it was wrong. Now the bill had come. The consequences reached the board before the lunch hour. Lawrence Whitfield's personal attorney called him with language that made Whitfield sit down in the middle of a sentence. Federal retaliation. Obstruction of a protected proceeding. A criminal referral attached to the property. Not a governance matter. Not something you smooth over at a board lunch. The order Preston Vale had signed. The move Whitfield had been so proud of, so certain was clean, had been identified in the federal file and named as the mechanism of obstruction, and it was now sitting in front of people who owed Lawrence Whitfield nothing at all. His contact at the trade outlet stopped returning his calls. The two board members he had leaned on the day before suddenly remembered urgent reasons they could not speak with him. By early afternoon, the board issued a 4-sentence statement expressing its full cooperation with the federal investigation and the company's independent review. Preston Vale's name did not appear in it. Within the week, both Whitfield and Vale would resign their board positions to avoid the appearance of a conflict, which is the language powerful men use when they have run out of room. The ballroom emptied slowly, like water finding its way out of a basin. The property's managers filed past Solomon with expressions he had not seen from them all week. Something open, something cautious, but real. A few made eye contact. One nodded. A young food runner Solomon recognized from his engineering walkthrough stopped briefly beside Isaiah Brooks on the way out and said quietly, "I'm glad you came back." Isaiah looked at him for a moment. "Me too," he said. Danny Okafor was last. She stood in the doorway and looked back at the room, at the empty chairs, at the table that still held a ring of master keys and 2 credential cards, at Solomon standing at the front, with his hands loose at his sides, and his face carrying the particular expression of a man who has finished something that needed finishing. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she turned and walked out into the corridor. And for the first time in 4 years at the Meridian Crown, she did not brace herself as she went. She just walked. The hotel was quieter that afternoon than Solomon had ever heard it. Not empty. The phone still rang at the front desk. The elevators still chimed. Guests still moved through the lobby. And bellmen still carried bags. And the kitchen still clattered. But the particular noise that had defined the building all week, the performative loudness, the laughter, that was really something else, wearing laughter's clothes, was gone. The air itself felt different, cleaner. Somehow, like a window had been opened in a room that had been sealed for a very long time. Solomon sat with Vivian in the managing director's office, the one that had been Margaret Lowe's, with 2 cups of coffee between them and the afternoon light coming through the blinds in long, flat lines across the floor. She told him about the reform package. And it was substantial. An independent ombudsman office for the entire company, reporting to the board and to outside counsel, never to local management, with a complaint line that no general manager could intercept. Monitor. Ordratse. A full audit of scheduling, promotion, and discipline at every one of the company's 23 properties, conducted by people with no stake in protecting anyone. Mandatory? Recurring anti-bias and accountability training, built and measured by people from outside the building, and a foundation, funded personally by Solomon, named for no one but its purpose, to provide hospitality scholarships and management apprenticeships to young people from the neighborhoods the industry had spent a century leaning on and never once lifting up. The board wants you to chair the implementation, Vivian said. All of it. Solomon looked at his coffee. They want it done right. she continued. And they finally understand what right looks like. He nodded slowly. She opened her portfolio and set a single page on the desk between them. He looked at it without picking it up. 5 employees who had filed transfer requests off this property withdrew them this week. She said, voluntarily. No prompting. He read the names on the page. All 5 of them. He recognized everyone. From his walkthroughs. From the careful, frightened way they had moved through this building at the start of the week. Camila Ortiz was on the list. Gloria Banks. Tyler Reyes. He sat with that for a moment. That, he said quietly, is the whole win, right there. Vivian looked at him. The federal case. The terminations. The clawbacks. The criminal referral. Whitfield and Vale off the board. That's not the win, that's the consequence. Solomon said. The win is the 5 people who decided to stay. She was quiet for a moment. Then she closed her portfolio and stood. Get some rest this weekend. Solomon. I will. He said. She almost smiled. He found Danny at the front desk 20 minutes later. The lobby was easing into the late afternoon lull. The next shift settling in. He stopped beside the desk and waited until she looked up. Office, he said. 2 minutes. She came in, and he closed the door. And he stayed standing. He did not go behind the desk. He stood in the middle of the room and looked at her directly. What you did this week, he said, is on the record with outside counsel. Your cooperation, your courage, your judgment, all of it noted, and all of it protected. She absorbed that with a short nod. There's something else, he said. He took a single sheet from the desk and held it out to her. I'm putting your name forward for the company's leadership development program, the one that builds the next generation of managing directors. This is the formal nomination. She took it. She looked at it for a long moment. I want to be clear, Solomon said. This is not a reward for this week. I have watched you for 5 days. The way you think, the way you move through a problem, the way you read people, and the way you refuse to look away from a thing that is wrong. He paused. You should have been on this track 2 years ago. The only reason you were not is that the man whose job it was to see you had decided not to. Danny looked at the page. She pressed her lips together for a moment. My mother, she said finally, is going to lose her mind. Something moved across Solomon's face that was almost, not quite, but almost a smile. Tell her, he said, that she raised someone worth bragging about. There was one more thing. A few weeks later, when the dust had begun to settle, when the Ombudsman office had taken its first calls and the foundation had its first cohort of names, Solomon Reese met Isaiah Brooks at a quiet table in the Crown's lobby cafe. Isaiah came in a little stiff, a little wary. The way you walk back into a place that broke you, even when the people who broke it are gone. The company owes you more than an apology, Solomon said, but you will have that too. In writing, from the board. And there is a settlement that Ms. Cross is handling. I would rather talk about something else. He slid a folder across the table. We are standing up the new training and accountability function for all 23 properties, building it from the ground up. It needs a director, someone who knows exactly what it feels like on the floor when the system fails. Because that is the only kind of person who will build one that does not. He looked at the younger man. I would like that person to be you. Isaiah did not pick up the folder right away. He looked at it. You don't have to do this, he said quietly. Hire me to make yourself feel better about. I'm not, Solomon said. I read your whole file. Isaiah. I read the commendations. I read the letter from that family with the disabled child. I read your write-ups, and I read the dates. And I know exactly what kind of manager they decided to throw away. He paused. I am not offering you this because of what they did to you. I am offering it to you because of who you were before they tried to convince you that you were nothing. That man should have been running a property by now. The only thing that stopped him was a building that decided not to see him. He let that sit. I see you. Isaiah was quiet for a long moment. Then he thought of a 4-year-old named Nia, and of the version of the world he wanted her to grow up believing in. And he picked up the folder. Okay, he said. Okay, at 1:30 that afternoon. Solomon Reese carried a tray from the staff cafeteria line and walked to the small steel table near the far wall. He sat down. The same table, the same seat, the tray in front of him, the worn notebook beside it, the coffee, black and hot. Everything was exactly as it had been on his first morning, except for the symbols that were gone from the section charts, and the sound of the room, and the weight of the air, and the fact that no one was standing in the doorway, watching with a smile, waiting for a chance to make a man smaller. He set his fork down beside his tray and looked at the table for a moment. Then he picked it up. The staff room door opened, and Danny Okafor walked through with her own tray. She crossed the room without being asked, without ceremony, and sat down across from him. She did not explain herself. She did not need to. They sat in comfortable silence. Then the door opened again. Tyler Reyes stood in the entrance with his lunch tray. 24 years old. 6 months on the job. Looking at the founder of the company with the particular uncertainty of a young man who was not sure of the rules of a world that had just changed under his feet. He had not laughed on Solomon's first morning. He had sat in his 15-minute survey and spoken carefully and honestly and hoped, in the quiet way young people hope, that someone was actually listening. Solomon looked up. Plenty of room, he said. Tyler crossed the room and sat. A moment later, Camila Ortiz came through the door. And then Gloria Banks. And then Isaiah Brooks himself, in his suit, with a tag that now said director clipped to his lapel. They sat down without being asked. The table filled. Solomon looked at it for just a moment. At the faces around him. At this ordinary steel table, in this ordinary staff dining room, in a building that, 2 months ago, had been a place where cruelty wore a uniform and silence was the price of keeping your job. He picked up his fork. He ate. And outside the staff room windows, the city moved through its afternoon, unaware, unhurried, carrying on, while inside the Meridian Crown, something that had been broken for a very long time quietly, finally, began to heal. If this story moved you, leave a like to support the channel, and subscribe so you do not miss the next one. And tell me in the comments, have you ever been judged by what you were wearing, or by the job you were doing, before anyone bothered to ask who you really were? And if you had been standing in that dining room when Solomon Reese was slapped to the floor, would you have laughed? Would you have looked away? Or would you have been the one who didn't? 2 more stories are waiting for you on the screen right now. Have a wonderful